I think Islam hates us.
They have done nothing except wreak havoc and terror for our faith and our religion.
When we stand up to those who oppress our communities, that Allah accepts from us that as a form of jihad.
Foundations of society are fragile. We must be the shepherds of our own civilization.
Anyone answers either yes or no without making necessary distinctions, both are not telling the truth. They're lying.
Father, we pray that your word will become a hammer that breaks rocks into pieces. That you will raise up in this nation pulpits and prophets that will call the nation back to repentance.
Will you distance yourself from those who think differently, or will you join us at the table and talk about what is really important? This is the Al-Ma'idah initiative, conversation without compromise.
Is what you're doing, is this sort of like your passion, or is it like part of your job? Or tell me a little bit about.
Is part of my job. It's both, obviously, but it's part of my job. So the Al-Ma'idah initiative exists to kind of facilitate friendship and conversation between Christian and Muslim communities. And the podcast is just an extension of that.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been thinking through a podcast for a long time. And so initially I started it with my friend Armand, and we were basically kind of going over a different topic. So basically it was like, we pick a topic, say Saudi Arabian politics.
Yeah.
And we try and do kind of an analysis of it, like a good breakthrough of it. And we then we kind of analyze from a Christian perspective what we thought, what we think should happen in a place like that. And what you can do, right? So if you're the king of Saudi Arabia who happens to be listening to this, here's what you should do. If you're a Saudi Arabian listening to this, here's what we think you should do. And if you're an American Christian listening to this, here's how you could do something.
Makes sense.
But it felt a little flat because I think if you're going to be always talking to people who kind of think the same as you, you've got to have a pretty amazing dynamic to be a good co-host. And it felt a little flat. And then we had a woman living with our family from Turkmenistan, and she's from a Muslim background. So she walked into the room when we were recording one time, and I said, "Hey, come join our conversation." And it immediately was so much more interesting when we did that. So at that point, we decided that we need to actually have conversations with people rather than just talking about things, basically.
Makes a lot of sense. Well, that's cool, man. That's awesome. That's nobody else is doing that, so that's cool.
No. So it's really it's really exciting. So when this releases, this will be about episode 34, depending on exact release order.
And do you guys release like every day, every week, every month?
Once a week.
Once a week, okay. And how's the podcast doing? Like, are you guys increasing listenership?
Yes. So there's several kind of metrics to it. So on Facebook, it's actually where we're kind of most successful because we kind of get the most social shares there. We do a little bit of advertising there. Here's a fun hack. If you make friends at Facebook, they get about $250 of free ad money every month for different things.
Just by making, what do you mean if you make friends? Like the work at Facebook.
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool, man.
So I have two people right now who work at Facebook, who like the podcast, who will give me about $100 a month to help advertise stuff.
That's awesome, dude. That is sweet.
Yeah,
that is sweet.
So that's a really helpful. That's a really helpful thing to know. And then I think YouTube, it really depends on the topic. Some things get like a ton of views quickly because a lot of people are talking about it. Others get others kind of grow slightly more slowly. So we did an episode on the Uyghur crisis a couple of weeks ago, and that got a ton of views pretty naturally. And then one of the biggest episodes we did Kashmir, which got about, I think it's probably on about 600 views for like the full hour and a half, or the full 2 hour episode. Right when the US did the strike against Qasem Soleimani, I managed to get an interview with a guy who was in the like Iraqi security forces about that, and a ton of people watched that as well.
Man, that is awesome, dude. That is sweet. That is sweet. Good stuff, man.
So usually the biggest jumps is when we're able to kind of dial into something a lot of people are talking about, and have an in-depth conversation about it. So last two episodes we did okay. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say your the vision of how do you say it again? Al-Maida initiative. The vision is to be like a news hub for the intersection of Christians and Muslims.
Not quite a news hub. More, think of it more like a sort of Joe Rogan Experience kind of vibe.
Oh, I see. No. Well, this is the. I'm talking about in general, just the vision of general.
The vision of the organization in general is to kind of build friendship and conversation between the Muslim and Christian world in a way that's not, that people don't feel like they're compromising to do that.
Oh, okay, great. Okay.
Because often with kind of interfaith things, people feel like they have to kind of, okay, I can only say so much stuff, otherwise I might offend somebody. And we're trying to remove that feeling. We're trying to let have an environment where people are invited to be honest and open and friendly, and so all while having meaningful conversations. So that's basically the premise.
Noble cause. I like it.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Who are you said? Sorry, I cut you off, but you said there was a couple last 2 episodes or something. You said.
Yeah, so I just did Palestine and Israel over the last 2 weeks.
I might have to listen to that then.
Yeah, so there's a guy called Hamza who is in Jordan. There was a power cut partway through the episode as well, and in Jordan when he was recording it. And then I had a guy called Yuri, who's an Israeli guy who's a scientist in Chicago, talking about that perspective of things. So
you had, it was like a 3-way.
Not that time. I'm planning to do it though.
That is sick, dude. That is sweet. how are you managing to, like, what's your strategy on kind of getting people's attention? Like, they might, I assume, these people that you're talking to is great guests. How are you getting their attention?
Honestly, with things like Middle Eastern politics, and like social issues, those sorts of things, right? I find that there are a lot of brilliant people out there who are thinking about these things with like no one to talk to about it.
Oh,
like,
wow.
They're just they're sitting on a bunch of thoughts, and most people don't have time for that conversation. So when somebody's willing to be like, hey, I want to talk to you for an hour and a half about this, they're usually really excited to go do that.
I see what you're saying. So yeah, I see what you're saying. Wow.
So I had an Afghani woman on the show about 6 weeks ago now, and maybe 5 weeks, but she was a nominee for a Nobel Peace Prize for, cycling across Afghanistan as a 15-year-old girl, right? Which is
that is awesome, dude. That is awesome. But just curious, is your mic right now, like the mic that you're using for the podcast, is that connected? Like, are you using that to record right now?
Actually, no.
Oh, you're just using the headphone, right? The Apple.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just curious because we're gonna have an interview like next week, or I gotta look at the schedule again. But it's like our first remote interview, and so I just want to make sure I have all my I's dotted and T's crossed, make sure I know what I'm doing before the remote interview. So that's why I'm asking you.
Yeah, as long as you can contest it all and it sounds good, it should work fine.
Okay.
But what I've learned is that for remote interviews, just the Apple headphones and the computer itself and Zoom just does a really good job at it.
Wow. Okay. That's great.
And then you can record straight from Zoom. So it's really, you don't need any external software for it. So it's really useful.
Yeah, for sure.
So you think about this Afghan girl, right? She leaves Afghanistan, is a student in Singapore, where like not many people in Singapore are thinking about Afghanistan.
Right.
So that kind of person, when asked, "Hey, this thing you're thinking about all the time, and there's no one to talk to around you, would you like to talk about that and record it?" Most people are really excited to do that.
That's very interesting. You wouldn't imagine that. You would imagine, I guess I would imagine that people are asking, people are wanting the time to talk about the topics that you're talking about. But it's just interesting how there actually isn't a lot of people that are interested in the specific topics that you're asking about, which is awesome. Which is a great opportunity.
Yeah, or at least they're interested, but they don't have the attention span to have like a kind of go as in depth as people want to go into, right?
Right.
So it's like being a sort of massive Star Wars fan or something, and you go to work the next day. It's like, hey, did everyone see Star Wars? And they're like, yeah, it was great. Hey, yeah. And then you say, hey, and do you want to talk about who you think that Ray's father really was? And everyone's like, what are you talking about? I'm just going to go back to work. So there's a certain attention span and there's goodwill and willingness to sort of listen and entertain it briefly. But a lot of people either aren't interested in having a longer conversation about it or can't hold a longer conversation about it as well. So this is an outlet for a lot of people to be able to have those larger conversations.
That makes sense. Cool.
So like last time we kind of connected in any length, you were still doing what, chemical engineering?
Oh yeah, man. I was gonna say that was a while back. Time just flies. When was it? What year was that?
I don't even know, man. It's going to be like 4 or 5 years ago at this point.
Yeah, so 4 or 5 years ago, I graduated UW in 2017. So yes, I graduated 2017, chemical engineering degree, and yeah.
And then what was the road between that and then starting the Executalks?
Oh, great question. So after college, after I graduated, I took a sales job in like building technologies and construction. So, we would go out and the heating and cooling in large commercial buildings. So you go to a building like, a big hotel like the Hyatt Regency or, the Columbia Tower or the Wells Fargo Center, like these big commercial buildings. They all need automated heating and cooling. And so the company I worked for, we sold and solutions like technology solutions to automate the heating and cooling. So I was going out and selling, like I was a salesman for that company. And then I eventually, like 6 to 7 months later, I got promoted to business development manager. And then 6 to 7 months after that, a large construction company named McDonald Miller, which you've probably heard of. We got rolling around. They asked me to come start like a division of their business. And so I went to McDonald Miller and started up a division for about 1 year and 6 months. And then, I don't know, I always, I feel like I didn't, I really loved the job, but I wasn't sure if when I was 45 years old, if I wanted to be doing that or not. And I think that the longer I wait to sort of stop and think and reflect, and take some time to explore what is truly my passion, then kind of the more risky it gets. Because as you get older, it's like you might have kids, but when you're young, like I suppose I'm semi-young, right? I'm 26. I don't have kids. I'm not married. Don't have a lot of obligations. Have a little bit of cash saved up. So I thought, you know what? This is not. My boss is not going to expect that I'm going to resign after 1 year and 6 months. But screw it. I'm just going to do it. And I did it. And we're still good friends to this day. Like we actually were texting yesterday. My former boss and I, and I'm kind of using this podcast, or what I'm doing with my friend, as a way to explore, just find something that clicks through the stories of others. And I know that I want to go into business one day, whether that's partnering with somebody or starting with a company and then working my way up or starting my own business. I know that that's the end goal at some point, but the route is what the unknown is. And so that's kind of what I'm doing. And my friend and I started to document these conversations because we found so much value in them, and because we thought that there's probably people out there that are in the same shoes that we're in, and that would also benefit from other people's stories and hopefully find something that clicks for them. So that's kind of the podcast. I guess it was a result of the realization that other people can benefit from the conversations that we are already having.
So how are you finding most of the people that kind of come on the show?
Honestly, the way we started was, this was, 4 months before I left my job. It was about a couple months before I left my job, about 2 months. We built a list. We just looked up, hey, companies in Seattle, right? And we just built a list of like, here are the top 150 companies in Seattle. Let's look at who their leaders are and just email them and find out, see if they were interested in doing this.
And what do you, and how responsive do you feel people are to that generally? Like, I mean, you've been in sales, right? So you're used to getting a lot of no's before you get a yes. But what's the general process like of getting leaders on the show?
Yeah, good question. So it starts out with an email, right? And then there's a process. So if they don't get back to the email, okay, 4 months later, we follow up with an email. And my friend handles a lot of that, by the way. My friend Ennis is way better at that than I am. But there's kind of a process of email, and you wait some time, then email again, you wait some time, email again. If they don't get back, you go in person, because we're in Seattle, so we can go in person. And usually when we show up in person, they're like, okay, these guys are serious, or this is something, like they're persistent. Like this isn't normal for somebody to come into the office and say, hey, why haven't you responded to my emails? So usually that'll work. And if it doesn't, in a lot of instances, they'll say, hey, we're just not interested, please stop contacting us. And if that happens, then we're like, okay, that's fine. It's probably just not a good fit for the show, and on to the next.
So for somebody who comes on the show, like, what do you think the value is for them? Why do you think they want to come talk about their story?
Great question. And I came to a realization after you had told me about, there isn't a lot of people that, like the former Nobel Peace Prize nominee that you were talking about. Not a lot of people actually reach out to her for that specific topic that you're talking about. So it's the same kind of thing with us. It's like people reach out to them for like, hey, can you get me, can you hook me up with a job, or can you tell me about your financial, goals of the company, or but when we reach out, it's more on a personal level. So it's like, hey, James, I saw one of your videos, and I saw that you have a British accent. Were you born here, or were you not born here? So it's a very targeted, very personal information that we are looking for, that not a lot of people are looking for also, if that makes sense. I think that's the key. That's the I guess secret sauce.
Right. So if they get sort of 300 emails a day, there's some very easy boxes to categorize them in, right?
By the way, they're not the ones that read the email, so
right.
Yeah.
You got to deal with the freaking gatekeepers.
Right, exactly. But sometimes, to be honest, there are times where there have been, the gatekeepers have actually been like they have actually been advocates for us. So it's like they will set up the meeting because they see our eagerness, and because they have that authority, like they can like pencil in without the permission of their boss. So I mean, it's sometimes it works to your favor. So you gotta make sure you play your cards right with the assistant as well as the actual person.
Right. So gatekeepers can be your friend, but there's lots of times they're not.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, because they're it's like imagine that you know in your home, right? You have a stash of cash somewhere or gold, right? If somebody's asking to see that stash of gold, your automatic response is going to say, no, 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 no. Like you're going to automatically try to protect it, right? So that's the same analogy with their time, with the CEO's time or whoever's interviewing. It's like their time is like we're automatically trying to protect their time. So you have to give me a very, very good reason of why they should spend time with you. So that's why their automatic response is no, and you have to get past that.
At one time I used to work in sort of outbound sales for tech, selling apps, and
Oh, which company?
it's called Subsplash.
Subsplash. Okay, when was this?
This was in it was like 2012 to January 2015.
Oh, so for 3 years. Okay.
Yeah, and I
Here in
remember,
Seattle.
yeah,
Okay, okay.
yeah, and I remember on one week I shared an office with somebody else, cousin Ryan, and I got shut down by a secretary, and he said, "I feel sorry for you, James, because of the British accent. If you call back again, they'll know who you are.
Oh
Whereas,
my god.
whereas me, they'll forget me and then just
Right.
didn't think about it." So I got shut. After that, I tried again a week later, but this time I just did a fake American accent. Like instead of telling her what I was doing, it's like, "Hey, is John there?" And she's like, "Yeah,
Wait,
sure."
say that again. Say that again.
It's like, "Hi, is John there?" And she's like, "Yeah, okay, I'll pass you through." And then we made a sale out of that. So it was
Wow. Wow.
So the moral of this story is that there's lots of competent, helpful gatekeepers who will put you in the right place. Other people just get a power trip and
Oh yeah,
aren't
100%.
really serving the needs of the company.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. And for the people that do have the power trip, you have to serve to that. So you have to make them feel like they're in control in order for them to comply. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, I hope I'm not having to deal with secretaries again. But
Right.
inevitably, I will be at some point in my life. So
Yeah, I mean,
I'll keep that under advisement.
the way I look at it is like secretary or not, it's just human beings, right? So people are just like anything else. People are machines. People are systems, right? So how do you? I guess you have to. The more you learn about people, the more you can, you know, more effectively persuade or communicate or you know get them to comply, I guess.
I think another advantage to what you're doing is that leadership is almost inherently lonely in some ways.
Oh my god, yeah, it really is.
So there's a certain extent, right? When you go through a new phase of life, you kind of need friends who are in that phase of life to some extent. Like when you have kids for the first time, it's not that you don't enjoy the company of people without kids, but there's a certain amount of you're just kind of dealing with another sort of realm of reality a lot of people aren't even aware of. And the same is true with leadership. There's this unique burden of it, and you're kind of giving people that opportunity to share some of that and say the things they actually believe in, that they really think about, that they've really driven them out loud in a way that probably not many people are actually asking them to do.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I mean, was that a question or?
No, I'm just kind of an out loud thought, right?
Yeah. No, it's definitely. Actually, one of the people we interviewed a little over a year ago. Oh, I just thought you were getting a text or something. One of the guys we interviewed about a little over a year ago recently wrote an article that says like how to be alone, essentially.
Yeah.
So yes, it is the higher you go, the more lonely it gets, I guess.
So having interacted now with a lot of top leaders in the city, what in your mind makes a good leader? What makes a bad leader?
Well, good question. I think it's subjective to you know how you define a good leader or a bad leader. So I guess in your opinion, how would you define a good leader versus a bad leader?
I think there's two main things in my mind of what makes a good leader, and it's competence and service.
What do you mean by service?
Service is that you're ultimately, so for me, it starts in the Bible, right? Jesus says, don't lord authority over each other like the nations do, but whoever wants to become greatest among you must first become your servant. So there's a certain implied humility there, which is about knowing your place. And that doesn't mean that the leader's job is to do everyone else's job and micromanage and take care of everything. But it's about knowing how you can lift up the most people, or at least the people you're supposed to lift up best, right? So you've got to know what your role is. You've got to know how to make other people succeed well. And you've got to pour yourself out for the benefit of others. That's one, right? Now you could have that kind of personality and be completely incompetent, and you wouldn't necessarily be a good leader, right? So leadership isn't entirely service, although service is really important. There's also a competence and innovation level as well there. But really, I think mix those two things well, then you're going to have, that's a good recipe. Also throw in courage. I think courage to say the things that need to be said, do the things that need to be done, and to be able to kind of stand and look criticism in the eye and not let it phase you too much is also really important.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, to your point, also, like all the, we believe in all the prophets. So I love the story that you brought up, and also Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He was known as a servant of God as well as a messenger. So the word servant is key, from what you're saying. So based on what you're saying, I would say humility is very important, right? Just humility, right? Being humble is a characteristic that's important in a leader. And then a bad leader, it's all the leaders I've talked to are not really bad leaders, but I would say just based off of, I guess, what's in the media, I would say that a bad leader is somebody who is not willing to accept their own mistakes. And I guess the number one thing is honesty. I think there was have you read the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People?
I'm familiar with it. I haven't read all of it.
By Stephen Covey. Yeah, it's a, I think we talked about it when we were having lunch. But anyway, that book, it says the number one, there's like a study that was done, and the number one characteristic that is like a deal breaker for all leaders, like for people to believe in a leader or to like want somebody as their leader, the number one deal breaker is honesty. So somebody's not honest, they could be humble, they could be competent, they could be like, no matter, they could be like great in every aspect, but if they're not honest, people will not want them as their leader. Like, it's just, honesty is key. Like you cannot be a liar and a leader at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think it also ties into humility as well, because if you think about it, right, the reason people lie is usually a pride thing. They don't want to look bad.
Oh, I see. Yeah, that makes sense. Yep, I can see that.
So they're kind of inflating that.
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, I think it's really important to think through where you start with that as well, because if you're not doing that well in the home, it's very difficult to export that. It starts with family, it starts with the people closest to you, and then sort of flows out of there, rather than you can't, I don't think it's possible to live in a dichotomy between personal and professional for very long. I think it all breaks down.
Yeah, you can't have like 3 different personas. I think, I don't know, you gotta have always, sooner or later people are gonna figure it out.
Right.
Yeah.
So now, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that kind of quitting a successful job and starting kind of entrepreneurial venture is not super common in the Arab community.
I agree. Yes.
So why do you think that is?
Because when you look at the roots of the Arab culture, it is it's very collectivist, which it's very family oriented, right? It's very much so like the goal of your existence, in the Arab world is to have kids and multiply and be a part of a big family. Like that is the goal, right? And I think that's also the case with cultures like, North African cultures, Asian cultures as well, some Asian cultures, right? Um, and when you do something like risky like that, you are risking the supply of income that will feed into you starting it's going to delay the starting of getting married, starting of a family, being part of a bigger family, right? It's going to delay that. And so the more risks you take, and 90% of startups will fail. So if you're 33, 34, and maybe you haven't saved up a lot of money to buy a house and start a family or whatever it is, right? Then just I guess the risk of that is a greater motivator than the potential of success of a venture or whatever. So I think that's what's key, is that the Arab culture is so collectivist and is so family oriented that the best, the advice is get a great job so you can start a family. And anything else is considered risky or not good.
What do you think Arab culture is missing out on as a result of discouraging entrepreneurship and being, I guess, timid of any kind of ventures like that?
I mean, I wouldn't say that they're missing out on anything, because life is, to me, is subjective, right? There's no right or wrong. I feel like life isn't binary, and that is right for a lot of people. Like, it's for a lot of people, going out and taking risks is not a good thing. It's better to just have a good job and start a family, right? So, I mean, I don't necessarily think that they're missing out on anything, unless they feel unhappy or they feel like that's not what's right for them. Then they're missing out on it. And if they are missing out on it, they should take some time to think about what really does give them energy and what is their passion and what they do really want. So it depends on, it's a case by case basis, I would say.
Okay, so let's take those. Let's forget about the cases where doctor, lawyer, success, right? They're happy what they're doing, their family's doing well. But speak to the guy or woman who's listening from an Arab background, or just sort of a Muslim background in general, who comes from a culture that's like this, who kind of has something in their sort of bones that I wish I could do this, but there's so many obstacles. What would you say to that person? What advice would you give them?
Man, that's a very good question. And this is in the context of they want to be like start their own business, right? Like entrepreneur.
Yeah, something like that, or quit med school, become an artist. I've had somebody on the show who you probably know Hiba.
Oh, Hiba, what's her last name?
Jamil.
Oh man, I'm not familiar.
She's
I feel embarrassed.
Yeah, she's a Iraqi woman living in Seattle who was on a kind of medical track, and then for several reasons just couldn't feel like she could do that anymore, and has successfully become a full-time artist.
Wow, that's great. That's great. I would say that if you feel like you've found like you feel like you know what you want to do, and the reason you're not doing it is because of your parents or because of you feel like you're indebted to your culture or whatever, and you live in America, I would say that the advice is to it takes a lot of time. The CEO for the company I used to work for, I used to sit down with him a lot, and we had lunch, and we spent a lot of time together. And the one takeaway that I took from him was, the longer you take to make a decision, the better the decision eventually is. So that's not to say take 10 years to make a decision, but it's, don't make reactive decisions. The longer you take, the better. So really think through your decision. Take a lot of time to think about your decision. And I'd say reading and writing is very important. Reading and writing is very important. So if you're interested in being an artist, read some biographies of artists that have lived, the greatest artists that have lived before, and just start kind of writing out your thoughts on like what you really want, like just in a journal or typing or whatever, right? Because through that process, you'll really figure out what it is that you like. You're just kind of like taking what's in your brain and like, it's like diarrhea for the brain, right? And I think through that process and over time, you'll realize that, hey, you know what, this, like, if I continue on this track, and I really want to go on this track, then, when I'm 40 or 50, I'm really going to regret it. And I'm also going to resent my parents for it. Like, there's a bit of resentment there too. So time, reading and writing, and just prayer, meditation, right? So, I mean, in Islam, we have what we pray 5 times a day. And the reason for that is because it keeps us aware and conscious that like we don't know when we will die. So make sure that every decision you're making is intentional. Make sure that every decision you're making is not for, you could be gone tomorrow. So make sure that you're not, doing things that you would regret otherwise. And I say if you do those three things, eventually you will figure out, the decision will just come to you on what the best thing to do is.
And one thing I found really helpful is that it doesn't have to be a kind of all or nothing thing right away. You can find outlets for what you want to do within the constraints of your existing life to some extent.
Yeah, it's true. True.
And I think the more you bring people in on those things that you're doing, the less of a shock it is when you say, okay, this is my full-time thing now.
Yeah, exactly. Like that's what I did with my dad. My dad's very traditional as well, but it took him about 6 months to warm, because I know the sales cycle, right? So you got to introduce it, and then 1 month later come back and talk about it. 1 month later come back and talk about it. 1 month later, and then eventually he warmed up to the idea and was accepting of it.
Right. So I think, and I think if we see our parents as people, right, that sometimes we have need some time to adjust to new ideas as well.
Yes.
And that if you can give them the benefit of the doubt and keep the conversation going, rather than it just being okay, right, you reject this, okay, then we're enemies in this area of my life. You can eventually win people and sell people and have a community around you to support those things.
Yes, agreed.
So what do you think, let's talk about, let's forget the sort of generation now, right? So your generation is coming from this where you're having, there's an uphill battle.
Uphill battle?
An uphill battle to innovate, right? Obviously, anybody who wants to go start something and be an entrepreneur is fighting somewhat of an uphill battle.
Yes.
Right.
Okay.
Anyone is.
Okay, got it.
And in some ways, that opposition may make you a stronger leader by what you have to overcome to do that.
Yeah.
What do you think, talk about the generation of your kids' generation, right? When you have kids, if you have kids, what do you think people who are our sort of age range can be doing to build that kind of leadership and innovate and that scope of innovation into our kids, so that we can be prepared to be good support and help in that when they grow
Uh, so if I'm understanding right, the question is, what can we do for the next generation
Yeah, is the next generation of entrepreneurs.
of entrepreneurs? Oh, I see. Okay. Um, that's a good question. I don't know that. Think about that. I mean, I would say it just comes down to a human level. Like, make sure that we're not judgmental. So be very open to. I feel like the more empathetic and the more open we are, the more somebody is likely to open up. So, and also what somebody says on the surface may not be what somebody's actually feeling or thinking. So, um, you know, just be empathetic, be inquisitive, and I would say make sure to understand their body language, like their language, right? So if I tell you, like, for example, I don't like my job, well, there's an underlying reason that I'm not saying, but you might have to kind of read between the lines. So I would say the better we get at reading between the lines, understanding human nature, understanding the language of humans, not just the verbal but nonverbal, the better we're able to understand the next generation, the better we're able to direct them or help them. If that makes sense.
That makes a ton of sense. So one thing that we've got to deal with now, right? And I'm curious to get your thoughts on, in the pursuit of success and work, how do you think through work-life balance, prioritizing life appropriately in that setting?
Very good question. Work-life balance, the American culture is very different from other cultures in the sense that American culture is 95% work, 5% life, right? And other cultures like Arab cultures and Asian cultures are very family oriented, so they might work 5 or 6 hours a day, whereas Americans are working 12 hours a day. If you ask, everybody's different, right? Because I know people, like some of the people we've interviewed, like they tell, we ask them, a common question we ask is, what's the worst advice somebody has ever given you, right? And there's this guy who started the marketing automation company in Seattle, and they're almost at about $100 million now. And he said, you know what, I don't like it. The advice when people tell me, hey, maybe you shouldn't be in sixth gear all the time. Go back to third gear or second gear. Like, you don't have to always be working. He's like, I don't really like that advice because working is my happy place. Like, working is where I feel most just like fulfilled and just where I get the most energy. And if you feel like working 16 hours a day is what gives you energy, then that's what's right for you. It's subjective. But if what's right for you is working 5 hours a day or 6 hours a day, find a job that fits you, what gives you energy, what makes you fulfilled. It's very subjective to the person, and that's how I view it.
That makes sense. I think for me, I think there's part of it that's subjective, and then I think you've got to have some. For me, I try and plan my life around my obligations. So, and those will change, right? So for me, I try and prioritize God, family, and then work. So tangibly,
Great.
what that means is I have young kids living in the house right now, and I have unique time to be with them in their formative years. So I'm really trying not to work too much between 5 p.m. and when they go to bed. Like, I'll occasionally do stuff in the evenings, but generally there's always more stuff that I could be doing, but I'm trying to focus in on this time with them now. There's an author that was asked a question one time, what's the most important book that you've ever written? And he answered by saying, the book that I didn't write when my children were young.
Who was that?
I actually don't know. I can look it up for you. I keep sharing the quote all the time.
Wow.
So I think once my kids are grown and out the house or a little needing less hands-on stuff, I think I really enjoy my work. And I want to do it more. But I have to prioritize around the well-being of the people God has given me to look after, which are my young children at this point. And ultimately, succeeding is kind of a faith thing at this point. That I trust that if I prioritize life the way God wants me to prioritize life, then the work I do will mean something, and it will succeed at the right time. But whereas it's almost easy to have work as this idol, and you can just sacrifice everything on it, and you can get some short-term gains from that. But very few people who sacrifice what they should have been paying attention to early on are going to be, oh, I'm so glad I worked 80 hours a week in my 20s when my kids were young, right? Now, it's not to say that everyone should have kids. I don't think everyone needs to do that or even needs to have a family. But if you're going to do that, I think you got to prioritize things in your life, and everyone has things to prioritize.
Yeah, no, I agree. That sounds great. And as long as you feel like it's giving you, and like every day you wake up, you feel, it doesn't have to be happy every day. I mean, we all have emotional cycles, but if you're waking up every day and you feel like what you're doing gives you energy and you feel like you're on the right path and you feel like it's right for you, then that more power to you, right? But some people are not like that. Some people, like I know an exec that doesn't have kids at all, and she's been working her whole life, and she's running a $200 million company, and she's happy. She doesn't have kids. She has a partner and a cat, and she doesn't even I don't think she's in contact with any of her family members. Now, that's not right for me, but that's right for her. So I don't know. I mean, it just depends on depends on who you are. You got to know who you are.
So for you, you talked about asking the question, am I going to be happy doing this at 45 with the job you were in before?
Correct. Yes.
So for you, what does fulfilled at 45 look like?
Good question. And I'm not sure that I have the answer to that specifically, like what industry specifically, but I am learning more and more about my true passions and interests. And I know that it's going to be a field in which there is, that involves a large scale study of people. So, like I'm really passionate about the psychology, human behavior, human nature, and the intersection of that and marketing and messaging and business. And so, I've narrowed it down to that. So I know that, I don't want to be an engineer. I don't want to be, I don't want to go into medicine. I don't want to go into law. So I've narrowed it down. But if you're talking about from a personal perspective, I think I measure the way I measure it isn't how much money I have or necessarily like the wealth, but I would measure it in how many people I've truly impacted. So if I can, like if somebody, and I don't know the exact number, like quantitatively, but qualitatively, if the more people that I can really help impact their lives in a positive way, the more fulfilled and successful I will feel, irrespective of how much wealth I have.
It's a good answer. So let's wrap up with this, right? So I'm just interested to kind of hear your reaction to this, right? So imagine you're driving down I-5 late at night, then there's an electromagnetic storm and you find yourself in Denny's, and you're able to choose any 3 leaders from history that you can get dinner with and learn from. Who would you pick?
I really like that. I like that question. Beautiful question. I would pick the Prophet Muhammad. So I said, I can answer like prophets, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. I would select Prophet Jesus. And I would select, man, who's one other leader I would select? I would say George Washington. because
choice.
George Washington was the founder of America. If you think about it, I mean, like not the founder, but he was the first president. He was a general. He, like, without him, there would be no America. You see
Yeah.
what I'm saying? So, and just his leadership. I mean, he must have had incredible leadership to do what he did. So, and I'm personally interested in American history just as much as I'm interested in, the history of the world, but American specific, because I live here, right? So
Right.
I would say those three: Prophet Muhammad, Prophet Jesus, and then and George Washington.
So those are great answers, because another thing I love about George Washington is that the fact that he could have functionally become king at that point, right? When the British are beaten.
Yeah, exactly.
There's this great restraint in him, which has blessed us, that has not been present in a lot of other men.
Yes.
For me, I would.
What are your three?
Mine's also Muhammad, actually.
Oh wow.
Then it'd be the Apostle Paul, and then Augustus Caesar.
Really, you wouldn't sit down with Jesus?
Well, I'm confident I'm going to meet Jesus at some point anyway.
Oh, okay. If we're thinking about that, then I mean, well, you said if you could have dinner with the three. You didn't say if you're going to meet them in the future.
Well, okay. So actually, to be fair, normally almost every other time I ask that question, I'm asking it to other Christians. So I specifically asked them to exclude Jesus, because everyone will pick Jesus, so it makes the answers more predictable.
Okay, got it. So say it again: Muhammad, and then who else?
The Apostle Paul and
Apostle
Augustus
Paul
Caesar.
and Augustus Caesar. So why would you want to talk to those two?
So I would actually just want to listen to Muhammad and Paul kind of push back against each other.
Ah, okay.
And talk about religion and life in the world, because as a Christian, right, I don't fundamentally agree with everything Muhammad said, but I have to acknowledge him as a kind of brilliant man in a lot of regards. And then Augustus Caesar is just kind of the grandfather of modern civilization in a way, that he's really, if you think about city planning, police force, fire brigades, all sorts of things that are normal parts of life come from the reign of Augustus Caesar.
Interesting.
And a lot of common law as well. So because the Roman Empire has so much impact on law and government, and even, you go to Washington, D.C., you look at the architecture, what do you see? You see giant white columns and a golden eagle at the top of the Capitol building. And well, where does that come from? It comes from Rome.
Wow, I didn't even know that. That's very insightful. I did not know that.
And so almost every European leader or in culture has almost tried to copy that in some ways. So even like Russia, right? So Germany, they had a Kaiser, which is Caesar. The Russians had the Tsar, which is Caesar. And there's so much influence of even the word prince, right, comes from the Latin word princeps, which means first citizen.
Wow, I did not. I might have to go grab a book on Augustus Caesar now. You got me interested.
Yeah, it's fascinating, but just Rome in general has had so much impact on the modern world, and I've loved that era ever since watching Gladiator, and I'd love to have a conversation with him.
Wow.
So why so Muhammad is an obvious choice as a Muslim, but what makes you pick Jesus out of all the other prophets?
Good question. Every prophet came with a miracle, is what Islam believes, and the miracle that Jesus had come with is medicinal in nature. So he would, heal things like just literally by touching them, and I don't know. I just find that fascinating, and he went through a lot of, I would say, I mean, all the prophets went through struggle, right? And if I could pick more, I would pick like Joseph. I would pick like a lot of other, but the struggle that Jesus went through is I think, so like when I think about the struggle that he went through, and all the prophets, but him specifically, it's just so like, it's crazy to me. It's like he was, like what they did to him, they spit on, like just being. I'm sure he felt alone, right? Like just all of them did. But I'm just saying, like how, like I just, man, I don't know. It's a good question, but I just would be in awe, to be honest.
Yeah.
It's just, yeah. There's like a million reasons I could come up with. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting for the sort of history of leadership, because there's a huge impact of the life of Jesus on how we think through leadership, especially in the West as well.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, right, in my country and a lot of other countries, you have a prime minister as the leader of the country. Do you know where that terminology comes from?
No.
It comes from the words of Jesus.
Oh, interesting.
Because he says, whoever wants to become greatest among you must first become your servant, right? First prime minister servant.
First servant. Wow. Okay.
So
I love that. I love that.
Right. So people have forgotten that at this point, because those words are really only used in politics.
Yes, yes, yes.
But the heart behind that is, you kind of have this Roman continuity, right? Everyone's trying to be Alexander the Great. Every European tyrant in history has tried to be Alexander the Great, somebody who's this great warrior, this great governor, and this great sort of thinker. Everyone's tried to be him. So you look at, and everyone, they're always trying to be like Alexander the Great, whether it's the Roman leaders, whether it's Hitler, whether it's Napoleon, all of them are inspired by Alexander the Great. The time that starts to shift in European history, and in a way that actually impacts politics, is about 500 years ago, when you have something called the Protestant Reformation. And basically what happens there is you get a widespread reading of the Bible and getting back to the core truths about who Jesus is. And that then affects some of the highest levels of culture and government at that point. And that's where the term prime minister comes from, because they're thinking, well, how does God actually want us to lead each other with? And it's like, not through this Alexander the Great type conquest and dominion, but through peace, through service, through giving yourself out to be a blessing to others. And that's what the life of Jesus is about. And obviously the West has done that well at some times and not so well at other times, but it's still very powerful in the sort of collective mind of what we're used to.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Wow.
Well, dude, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. I don't feel like I'm necessarily qualified, but I'm honored to be on your show.
There's no qualifications. It's I like talking to interesting people doing interesting things, and the only qualification is what you're doing is being, or what you're thinking about is somewhat interesting to me, and that's the only qualification. And it's just by happenstance that I get Nobel Prize nominees and such, but it's just kind of the way it shakes out. So thanks for being here, and thank you guys for listening to the Almeida Initiative podcast. We will be back next week.